Okay, let's unpack this. Few stories echo through time, quite like the Great Flood. It's a narrative so powerful, so resonant, it often feels almost universal. But where do these stories really come from? Are they all connected somehow, or is it something else? Today, we're plunging right into that question, and our guide is, well, an incredible text. Part 1, Chapter 4 of Sir James George Frazer's huge work, Folklore in the Old Testament. Now, Frazer himself, in his Huxley lecture, he wasn't really approaching this like a geologist, trying to prove it happened. Instead, he took what he called a diluvial view, focusing on how these traditions, these actual stories, show up across so many different cultures. So our mission today is to pull out those surprising bits of knowledge, those insights from his research, to help you really get what's so captivating about these tales.
Exactly. And what's so compelling about Fraser's work here is that it's not really about validating one single historical event. It's much more a profound anthropological study. It explores how we as humans experience catastrophe, how we make sense of it, and then how we weave those experiences into stories that last for generations. So we'll be looking at the patterns, the unique cultural twists, and I suppose the why it matters behind all these flood narratives.
Okay, so where do we start? Where better than with the tales most of us kind of recognize, right? And the really ancient ones that shaped them. Let's dive into those rich stories from ancient Mesopotamia.
Right. If we look at the Babylonian flood narrative, the detail is just, well, it's incredible. It tells of the god Ega, who warns Caesar, sees the 10th king of Babylon, warns him in a dream. And the instructions are super precise. Build this massive ship, store a history of the world in a place called Sipar, and bring aboard his family, his friends, and crucially, all living creatures, birds, four-footed beasts, everything. The ship itself is even described, multiple stories high, 9 rooms inside each of its 6 stories. It's very specific.
And here's where it gets really interesting and honestly a bit clever on the gods' part. The warning wasn't direct, was it?
No, that's right.
Ea apparently whispered his instructions not straight to Xisuthris, but to a reed hut, or maybe a wall, with Utnapishtim, who's often identified with Xisuthris, listening on the other side. That way, the god wouldn't, directly betray the other god's decision to wipe out mankind. That's quite the divine loophole.
It really is. A very neat sidestep of divine protocol. And after the flood, which maybe surprisingly only raged for a day, though the waters rose high in the mountains, the story describes the gods themselves as, well, terrified by what they'd unleashed. Ishtar, the queen of the gods, she's shown crying out like a woman in labor, just lamenting the destruction of her people. Utnapishtim eventually lands on a mountain in Armenia. He sends out birds to check if the land is dry and then offers a sacrifice. Even in Lil, the god who was initially furious that anyone survived, he's eventually calmed down by Ea's pleading and actually blesses Utnapishtim, gives him immortality.
Wow. And what's so powerful, I think, is that these aren't just like oral myths passed down. They're rooted in actual archaeological finds, aren't they? Can you tell us a bit about that, the evidence?
Absolutely. Fragments of this exact story have been dug up, most famously in the library of the great Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, that's 7th century BC. But even more compelling, there's an older tablet, though it's pretty damaged, from King Amizaduga's time. That pushes it back to maybe 1966 BC, roughly. So it confirms just how incredibly ancient these stories are. And we should remember there's a Sumerian version too, even older than the Semitic one, which connects the flood directly to the creation of humanity.
That's just incredible. Literally etched in stone thousands of years ago. Okay, so let's pivot to the perhaps more familiar but still distinct story from Genesis. Here, the narrative tone shifts a bit. God sees humanity's wickedness and, well, the text says he repents making them, decides to destroy all flesh. But Noah, who's described as righteous, he found grace in the eyes of the Lord.
Yeah, and in Genesis, God gives Noah incredibly precise instructions for his ark too. Go for wood, seal it with pitch, inside and out. 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 high. Lower, second, and third decks. Very structured. Noah's told to bring 2 of every living thing, male and female, to keep them alive. But here's a key difference from the Babylonian story. Noah's also told to bring 7 pairs of all the clean animals. That's a notable addition. The flood itself lasts 40 days, but the waters take much longer, 150 days, to fully go down. The ark rests on a mountain, though the specific one isn't named, like in the Babylonian version, on the 17th day of the 7th month. And then Noah sends out a raven, then a dove, which comes back with that famous olive leaf, a sign of hope.
The similarities between these two, the Babylonian and the Hebrew, they're just so striking, aren't they? It makes you ask, how do we figure out which came first, or how they relate?
It's a crucial question, and Frazer dives right into it. He notes that the Hebrew story, especially the part scholars call the priestly narrative in Genesis, which is often dated to around the time of the Babylonian captivity, maybe 6th century BC or just after. That part shows really close similarities to the Babylonian text, like the detailed measurements, the use of bitumen or pitch, the older bits of Genesis, the Jehovistic narrative, maybe 9th century BC. They're less precise on those points. So this strongly suggests, as Frazer argues, that the Hebrew story was probably derived from, or at least heavily influenced by, the older Babylonian tradition, rather than being, a completely separate account or the absolute original. It shows that cultural exchange was happening even way back then.
Right, so we've got this powerful Mesopotamian story seemingly influencing Genesis, but these flood tales, they aren't just stuck in the ancient Near East, are they? What's just fascinating is how this idea, this concept of a massive flood, echoes right across the globe, often with wildly different, sometimes really surprising details. Makes you wonder.
Oh, absolutely. Even in Europe, while maybe less common than elsewhere, you find traditions. The Icelandic Younger Edda, for instance, tells of a flood, but get this. It's a flood made from the blood of a slain giant, Ymir, a very different feel. In Lithuania, there's a story where a god saves humanity in a nutshell.
A nutshell.
Yes, a nutshell. And after the flood, a rainbow appears, but it tells the survivors to jump over bones to create new people. 9 new couples spring up. Even a gypsy story talks about a good man warned by a fish, a flood lasting a year, and the god Numitarm recreating everything afterwards.
That nutshell detail is amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, moving over to Asia. India gives us Manu, right? And the fish who warns him, guides his ship tied to the fish's horn, classic. But then you get the Santals of Bengal, and their stories talk about firewater or fire rain floods, people hiding under trees and caves, and a snake becomes the rainbow to stop this fiery downpour. What does that kind of elemental twist suggest?
It really points towards different kinds of local catastrophes being remembered, doesn't it? Maybe volcanic activity or something else entirely. And speaking of unique twists, down in the Malay Peninsula, there's a story where animal fights at a feast accidentally cause a flood, and a cat saves everyone by making the waters go down. Quite the unlikely hero.
A cat.
Yeah. And the Ainu people up in Sakhalin, they even explain how rivers and mountains formed. A pig drained the floodwater, and a snake carved out the riverbeds. So these aren't just about destruction, they're creation stories too, explaining the landscape.
It's also interesting how some cultures seem to deny having flood stories, but then you find accounts anyway, like that Chinese emperor who said, nope, not us, but then there's a Mongolian account talking about a flood leaving oyster shells way inland. Physical evidence, sort of. And a Sumatran Batak legend connects a flood to the discovery of fire. They needed it because the flood left them cold. It shows how deeply these events could impact basic survival and, well, innovation.
And then the Americas, just packed with rich narratives. The Mexican Codex Chimalpopoca tells of Nada and Nina escaping in a cypress log. But then, when they cook some fish afterwards, a god gets angry and turns the fish into dogs. A really bizarre, transformative detail.
Wow.
Other stories, like from the Huichol or Pima peoples, involve a goddess or a figure called Elder Brother saving people, maybe in a box or a big jar. And that container later becomes a sacred mountain. So survival is tied directly to the holy landscape. The Mandan people in North America even had an annual ceremony, the Mini Rokahasha, specifically celebrating the end of a great flood. They kept a model big canoe structure right in their village. The story was alive, part of their ritual life.
Yeah, it's striking how common that theme is. The lone survivor, or maybe a small group, often with animals finding refuge somewhere. But in some traditions, like the Ojibwe and Cree, the heroes Menaboshu or Wisiketchak, they don't just survive passively. They actively battle sea monsters or tricksters, and then they send animals like muskrats diving down to find bits of earth to literally recreate the world. It's a much more active role for the survivors, isn't it? They're almost partners in creation.
That's a really important distinction, yeah. And then you look at Oceania, lots of islands there, lots of volcanic and seismic activity. So many of their flood stories seem very localized. The Tahitian god Taroa, for example, supposedly overturned the whole world, leaving just a few mountain peaks sticking out as islands. Clearly reflects massive geological upheaval. Or, in Roti, an island in Indonesia, the sea demands a sacrifice of an animal whose hairs can't be counted. They try various things, but finally a cat is offered. And apparently counting its hairs is impossible, so the sea gets frustrated and recedes. Again with the cat.
Cats seem unusually important in flood myths.
Apparently so.
But this brings up a really critical question, doesn't it? How do we tell which of these are genuinely ancient, homegrown myths versus ones maybe influenced later by outsiders?
Frazer tackles this head-on. He points out that some stories, like in Minahasa in Celebes, or from certain tribes in New Guinea. They show definite biblical coloring, as he puts it, specific details like sending out the raven and then the dove.
Ah.
That strongly suggests influence from Christian missionaries, probably in more recent centuries. But at the same time, it's clear that many other stories, especially on islands prone to them, are deeply rooted in local events like tsunamis or volcanic eruptions. So it's a real mix. You've got independent invention based on local reality, and then later layers of cultural borrowing or influence. It's complex.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together, what does Frazer ultimately suggest about where these incredibly widespread flood stories actually come from? Because for a long time, the main idea, especially in the West, was that they were all just, distorted memories of one single global disaster, like in Genesis.
Right. But Frazer, leading heavily on the geology of his day, people like Huxley and Lyell, he makes it very clear. Modern geology, even back then, offered absolutely no evidence for a global flood happening during the time humans had been around. Zero. Plus, he points out, the Genesis story itself has internal inconsistencies, things that don't quite line up if you try to read it as a precise eyewitness account. It challenges the idea of it being, a contemporary journal of the event. It's a powerful cultural text, but not a scientific report.
That's a huge shift in thinking. So instead of one big global event, Frazer argues for something else. Myths of observation. What does that mean exactly?
It means stories arising from observing real, local, but devastating natural events. And then those events get woven into grander, more mythic narratives over time. Think about Mesopotamia again. Those huge annual floods of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they're often catastrophic, caused by heavy rain and snowmelt up in the Armenian mountains. Completely destructive. Ancient cities like Shurippak were known to have been wiped out by these floods. Frazer suggests that kind of regular, devastating event is the likely basis for the Babylonian story. And by extension, the Hebrew one, too, where rain is the main cause. And archaeology backs this up. You find layers of flood silt in the ruins of these old cities.
Okay, so river floods explain Mesopotamia. But what about other types of floods mentioned? You said the earth itself plays a role.
Exactly. Remember the Hebrew story mentioning
Yeah.
subterranean waters bursting forth?
Yeah.
That finds a real-world parallel in earthquakes, especially in areas with soft alluvial ground.
Yeah.
Big quakes can literally cause water to shoot out of fissures. It was observed happening in places like Wallachia in the 19th century, and even along the Mississippi River. It looks like the earth is flooding from below. And then, of course, you have seismic sea waves, tsunamis,
Huge ones.
terrifyingly common in the Pacific Rim. They wiped out coastal cities in Peru, like Callao, multiple times. Devastated the coast of Japan in 1896, waves 6 to 20 feet high. Often, the tsunami is far more destructive than the earthquake that caused it. And these events perfectly explain many of the flood stories from islands and coastal regions, particularly in Oceania and the Americas.
And what about those fire floods you mentioned earlier, like with the Santals? Those obviously aren't water.
Right. Those fire floods probably relate to other kinds of local catastrophes. Volcanic eruptions are a strong possibility. Think about pyroclastic flows or massive volcanic mud flows, lahars. They would absolutely feel like a fiery flood wiping everything out. It just shows how people mythologize whatever the most destructive force in their particular environment is.
So besides experiencing these actual disasters, Frazer also talks about another source for these stories, misinterpreting things people saw.
Yes, another type of myth of observation. This time based on misinterpreting natural features in the landscape. For example, finding seashells or marine fossils high up on mountains. To people without modern geology, the logical explanation: the sea must have once covered those peaks.
Makes sense.
So you get flood stories arising from that observation in places like Mongolia, Celebes, even among some Eskimo groups. Or think about a dramatic landscape feature, like the Tempe Gorge in Greece. Ancient tradition said Deucalion's flood ripped the mountains apart to create it. But geology tells us it was formed by slow river erosion over vast amounts of time. The human mind sees something dramatic and creates an equally dramatic story to explain it.
Okay, so let's bring it all home. What's the big picture Frazer paints after looking at all these legends from around the world?
Well, basically, instead of one single source, one universal flood, Frazer suggests these legends form a complex tapestry. They're woven from many different threads: real local disasters, river floods, tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanic events, combined with human observations, sometimes misunderstandings, of the natural world. And then layered on top of that, you sometimes get cultural diffusion stories spreading from one group to another, like the biblical narrative carried by missionaries much later. Ultimately, he sees it as a powerful testament to the human mind's enduring need to explain, to remember, and to tell stories about the most profound and often the most terrifying forces that shape our world.
Wow. We've really journeyed far, haven't we? From ancient Babylon to remote Pacific islands, seeing fire floods in India, water draining pigs in Asia, all through Frazer's lens and folklore in the Old Testament. His deep dive shows that even though the details, the causes, the heroes, they all differ wildly, that core human experience, facing overwhelming natural power and then finding a way to rebuild, to make sense of it all. That seems to be a truly shared thread across humanity.
Yeah, and if we connect that to the bigger picture, what might these incredibly persistent stories tell us? Not just about our past, maybe, but about our ongoing relationship with the power of nature and perhaps our deep-seated drive to find meaning, to find order, even when faced with absolute chaos.
That really is a powerful thought to leave you with. A reminder, maybe, of how deeply our cultures are tied to the planet's raw power and how our need to narrate that relationship has created such universal yet diverse tales. We hope this deep dive has given you a useful shortcut to being well informed on this truly epic subject.